Hey guys, how are you? It's me, Lauren B. Welcome to the Untitled Tarot. So I wanted to sit down and I wanted to do a reading today. I wasn't really sure what or for whom I was pulling for, but I have been really interested in doing these sub-collective readings. They're really interesting for me and they're really fun as well. The collective as a whole is so big. It's 8 billion people, and I can definitely pull out like common denominator themes and energies and read on that. But the idea of really kind of taking a closer look at these sub collectives feels like it is a much better benefit to whomever I'm reading for, and it's definitely more interesting for me as a reader as well. So I've done a sub collective reading on the shadow workers. I did another one called the mystery reading, which was for like a different collective. I'm kind of just bopping around and it's been sitting on my spirit lately. And it's actually a reading that I had planned to do in February because I have some Capricorn placement. So I usually map out like a lot of the work that I tend to do, usually like a month ahead. It's just, I like that. It makes me feel good. And so I had it on my spirit to do a reading for readers. I was thinking about that. As readers, as healers, energy workers, like we're kind of our own collective, especially those of us that are kind of out here doing it more publicly. We definitely are our own collective, and we're always doing readings for the collective or different collectives, but for which we are absolutely a part of as well. But I haven't really seen a lot of readings for us. And so I had it on my schedule for February, and maybe I'll come back in February and I'll kind of do a series of these readings for readers. But as I sat down today and I started to pull out the cards, I realized that in fact, this is a spread. This is a reading for readers. Now, as I said before, it feels like the focus is primarily on those of you, of us that have been reading for a while, particularly those of us that are doing it more publicly. But this can absolutely cover any of you that are readers as well, or those of you that are just beginning your process of coming online, being a little bit more public with your messages, or at least being more open. You could be the reader at your job, in your family, in your work life, right? You don't necessarily need to be online in order to have a platform, right? So as an umbrella, this is for readers. So however you resonate with that in terms of how you do your work in your life. But there does seem to be a particular emphasis on those of us that are out here a little bit more publicly doing these spreads day after day, week after week. And it's such an interesting concept for me to do a reading for us, because we kind of have a very specific process that we go through, and we're on a very specific journey. And so because of that, we might need more specific guidance. And so I'm really excited to come on here and do this reading. It's very interesting. This might be a little bit of a longer reading. So just kind of buckle in, like get a tea, get a cookie, get a drink, like just nestle in for a little while. I do think I'm going to extend this reading at the end because I already peeked at some of the other cards that I noticed on the top of the deck. So there likely will be an extended to this reading. So if you stick through to the end and it does resonate and you do want to know more, check the description box. The link to the extended reading will be in there. So I used 2 decks for this reading. I used the Good Tarot and I used the Mystical Shaman Oracle, which is a deck that is kind of profound for me. It was definitely a deck that I got when I hit like a lot of initiations and activations, and it was a deck that I got when my spiritual journey really kind of kicked up a notch. But it's not a deck that I use that often, but it really wanted to come forward. So I know that when the Mystical Shaman Oracle like wants to present itself in a reading that I'm doing, that like the messages are gonna be like what's that saying? A coat of a different color, a horse of a different color. So it seems like that's a little bit of what we have going on today. So let's pray and we will get into this message. Very good? Very good. Father God, thank you for bringing me and everyone in for this reading. I ask that you give me wisdom, clarity, and discernment to deliver these messages accurately for everyone's highest of love, light, alignment, and assignment. We praise you, we love you, we thank you always. We give you all the glory and the honor for these messages to the utmost high. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. So we're starting out with this Page of Air card. Now, this feels like a big release. It feels like a big opening up that seems to be happening. See this feather above her head? It's almost like she's kind of casting it out and over to the readers. Now, part of what seems to be being released to us is this corn card. Now, corn's really symbolic of harvest and abundance, but people throughout the generations have been able to utilize corn in many different ways in order to sustain things. So just coming out the gate, there seems to be this release of resources, things that are a necessity to us, so that way we can keep coming forward and doing the work that we do. The Journey card comes up next. There is a Luminous Warrior card in this deck, but there isn't a Wounded Warrior card. And when I look at this Journey, that's what it feels like to me. It's the idea that like many of the readers right now are very much kind of worn down and they are battle weary. That over particularly the last year, but really over the last 3 years, there has been just a lot of upheaval, a lot of really uncomfortable transformation. I think a lot of us have been in these seasons of personal and spiritual stretching. We've been through a lot of stripping. There has been a lot of sacrifices that have had to be made in order for us to come forward and do that work. And again, one of the main ones might have been our stability or the resources that we have been able to bring in to sustain ourselves. That's part of the reason there seems to be this sort of release of like care packages that are coming in to kind of help stabilize us after a very long time of instability, on top of all of the very nuanced kind of difficulties and battles that we've had to face in our natural lives, but also spiritually, like in the ethers, in the astrals, in ourselves, just sort of all of it. And like there is this feeling of like we're very strong now. We've become very, very strong, but it costs a lot to become this strong. That if people kind of look at you and feel as though like you are gifted and that you're talented and you're really tapped in, they might not recognize like the price you had to pay as a spirit, like as a person in order to get to that point, right? You have to lift a lot of weights in order to become very strong, in order to build those muscles. And so this definitely feels like a relief coming through this release of some kind of resources, some kind of necessities that we need that are coming through. Now, the 10 of Air comes up next, which in many ways, this feels very much like an answered prayer. There also seems to be another aspect of another request that is being addressed. So it also feels like throughout the last year, 3 years, part of what a lot of us have been asking for as well is a shift in the energy or a shift in the messages that come through. Feathers, she's surrounded by these feathers. It's the idea that we've kind of been inundated by all of these messages for such a long time, almost like spiritually kind of overstimulated in a way. But all of these feathers look the same, so it's kind of like the same energy, and it's like the same stories, it's the same messages, it's the same guidance. It's kind of repetitive, right? It's just been coming through and coming through. And I know for me, there have been many times that I've been like, give me something else to read, like give me something else to talk about. And some of those moments have been really beautiful for me because they've been moments of like this really kind of expansive creativity, right? It's how I came up with the Untitled totems. It's how I came up with the lots. It's how I came up with the mystery school that I run, right? So like there is kind of a benefit in that. Sometimes stagnancy does ask for inspired action, but I do feel like so much of what we've been asking for is like new stories and messages and new guidance to give as well. Just kind of like this break in the repetition. This Ace of Water comes up next. And so, one, it's kind of like, where is the gold? Like, almost like, where's the good stuff? Like, kind of, where's the good news? This seahorse is holding a pearl, which is wisdom. So it's sort of like in the sea of all of these messages, like, what is like the right one to give? Like, what's going to be the most helpful or beneficial? And when I look at the Ace of Water, the Ace of Cups, it's such a card for me of healing. It's like this card of fulfillment, of like spiritual nourishment. And so there's kind of this sense of asking, like, give me something that will nourish people's minds and their spirits, that will have like a positive impact on them, something that's a little bit different, right? So there seems to be kind of a response to that particular request, and it's coming through via the child. Now, it struck me that this child looks far too similar to this wounded warrior energy. What seems to be coming through is that the entry point for new guidance, for new inspiration, for joy, for healing, the entry point is through the child. But because the child has taken on so many of the characteristics and so much of the energy of the wounded warrior, that the inner child has had too many layers on it to be permeated. And so if we've been seeing a recycling of the same energy and the same messages, it's because for new messages to come in, for different spiritual food to be distributed, it would almost kind of go to waste, just in the sense that it wouldn't be fully absorbed by the entry point that is the child. It wouldn't be able to permeate all of these layers. Now, I have like this personal anecdote about this child. I mentioned this in a video I did like 2 years ago when I first started my channel. And over this corn card, it kind of reminds me of when I was very, very young. I was like 3 or 4 years old. And my mom and I lived with this very nice older lady who later came to be called my Grandma Anna. And she had these cornfields in her backyard. And it was the 90s. I just used to run all by myself all through these cornfields, and the sun would go down and like the big wild turkeys would come out and they'd chase me around, and I'd scream and I'd giggle. And it's like the first time that I consciously remember like tapping into magic or feeling something bigger than myself. It was like this really special moment for me, right? That I first came into awareness of when I was a child, before like the layers of the world really like sunk its teeth into me. But there's this story that I have about my Grandma Anna, that she had this gorgeous garden right by these cornfields, and she grew all kinds of stuff, these gorgeous Jersey tomatoes. And she always used to try and make me eat them. And I don't like raw tomatoes. And me and her would have these bitter battles over these damn tomatoes on my plate. And she'd tell me, she's like, don't be dramatic. They're good for you. Eat them. Like, you have to eat them. And I tell her, if you make me eat it, I'm going to get sick. I'm telling you, don't be dramatic. Eat your vegetables. Okay, sure. So I'd eat these tomatoes, and inevitably, just as I had prophesied, I would get sick. And it was this funny moment for me that I realized, like, if you force me to swallow something that does not agree with my spirit, if you force me, I'll do it, but sooner or later, I'm gonna spit it right back up. And so there seems to be something similar going on with this child here. This kind of segment of the collective child, that they've sort of been forced to kind of swallow and endure like great difficulty. And they have yet to spit it back up. And it's like tomatoes, it's like this acidity. It kind of just wears them down, just like the heaviness has kind of worn a lot of us down in recent times. And that there is a need for like the inner child within the collective to kind of spit up this acidity, to release the aspects that they've taken on from the warrior's journey that wasn't kind of theirs to fight, right? And once they're able to do that, that entry point will then be clear. It's like clearing out rocks from the front of a cave. That entry point will then be clear for new messages, new spiritual nourishment, new guidance to come forward for them. But if it seemed like the energies and the messages were really repetitive, they were. And part of the reason why, it was kind of like smoothing a stone. It's like slowly kind of wearing down the warrior aspects that this child took on and very much needs to take off. So we come to the Seven of Air after that. And this seems to be almost like a request that feels like it's kind of being asked of us in the way that we do our work. Again, there seems to be this release of like necessities or resources that we need to create more stability in our lives, right? But there also seems to be a release of or a change in the way that we come forward and we do our work. This Seven of Air card for me, I always call it like my mother duck card, because she just like, she has all these little ducklings around her, right? And it's kind of like they all want her advice or her counsel. They want her guidance, like they are looking for her to direct them. Now, I know you're not a crossing guard, but it feels more like a lot of the way that we read is we kind of look over and observe the messages and we read what we are observing, which is great. But there seems to be a small shift that is asking us to not just read what we are observing in the energy, but also direct the flow of the energy into a more constructive or beneficial place. It reminds me of this lyric from this song, and I can't remember who sings it, so don't ask me. But she says, "We don't ride the wave, we create it." And so that energy is kind of coming forward of asking us to just make this slight little adjustment in the way that we previously were just reading what we were observing, and instead, or in addition, start to direct the flow of energy, start to create a different wave into a more beneficial place for other people, because the Ace of Fire comes out next, which for me is always this like call to action. And so it's almost like we are being called or asked to direct the flow of the individual collectives that we read for. We all read for the collective, we read over overlapping collectives, but we all have like our own individual little corners of the world that we read for. And so it feels like we are kind of being asked to, and it feels, with the Seven of Air, it feels soft, right? It feels like a gentle, again, it's like this motherly duck energy. It's not heavy masculine energy, but being asked to direct that flow of energy, direct the path a little bit more. Almost like give them this little lantern. It's almost like give them your hermit's lamp, and don't observe the energy, direct them into like which path is going to be like the most beneficial for them. It's almost like when you see the problem in the energy that you're reading, also try and look past that and find the path that will have the best solution to it. It's taking like a little bit more of a proactive as opposed to like an observer role. But again, it's not heavy masculine energy. It's doing it in kind of like a gentle way. It's more of like, it's like kind of blowing the energy or molding it like clay. It's not this heavy, I'm a leader. Like it's not that. It's not like evangelist type of energy. I hope that you are kind of picking up what I'm throwing down. But part of the reason that it feels like we're being asked to do this is because of the Soul Retrieval card. So the Soul Retrieval and the King of Earth are coming up next. The King of Earth, I feel like, is sort of like this intermediary energy that's coming forward. They brought to my attention, they reminded me that kings were not only historically kind of appointed, but they were also anointed. Royalty, kings and queens, they were considered to be anointed or like handpicked by creation, by God, right? So it's like they had not only like a practical authority, but like a spiritual authority as well. But because it's the king of earth, this is like this intermediary energy. This might be kind of representative of like our collective guides. And it's talking about this soul retrieval. What I notice in this is that there is this sort of moth energy, which is really symbolic for me of like psychic expansion and enhancement. But I always, and this comes through every time I pull this card, it always feels like they are trying to make their way back into the cocoon. It's sort of like when you expand a little too much and you start to feel a little bit uncomfortable and you kind of like to return back to safety. I feel as though this energy is being represented by the next wave of like awakening people. So part of what I also think is going on is that there is a new wave of awakenings that are happening, and they're kind of en route. They are kind of making their way towards us. But part of what they may be experiencing is that their gifts, their intuition, their consciousness, all of this stuff, it is expanding faster than what they are comfortable with. And so I was kind of sitting with that energy for a while, and I'm trying to figure out like kind of what they mean. And they gave me this interesting example of metal. Stay with me. That when human beings started using metal, right, we were able to use it to make tools, right? Tools for agriculture, tools for hunting, but we also turn them into weapons in which to kind of persecute and kind of war against each other. And it brought up that an interesting concept to me that sometimes we have access to power or technology that we may not have the wisdom, the maturity, or the structure for, right? We still do it to this day. We have all of this technology and we use so much of it for kind of like these very silly, some of these very kind of petty purposes. We still use them for violence against each other, right? We're not using them to enact, positive climate change. Like even now, like in 2022, we still have access to technology and power and ability that we are not mature enough. Our consciousness hasn't expanded far enough to use it appropriately and responsibly. And so I hope that makes sense, because it feels like part of what's happening for this big new wave of collective that's coming forward is that they have abilities, they have consciousness, their intuition, all of this, their spiritual circuits are being activated now, and they're coming online and they're expanding way past the point of where their experience and like their wisdom, remember the Ace of Water on top of that, their wisdom and their experience and sort of like their perimeters end. It's interesting. And I think that that's similar for us as well. Like when I first came online, like when I first woke up, my abilities, they just went. It was like one awakening after another wave of ascension. And it was really hard for me to keep up with that because I didn't have any training. I didn't have like a spiritual mentor. I didn't know what was going on. And so there were many times, especially in the beginning, that like I was expanding way past the wisdom that I knew. I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't have a lot of experience in spiritual work, the spiritual arts, the energy that was floating around. Like I didn't really understand it. I was expanding way past my point of experience, and it was very easy for me to kind of fall into like these little bouts of kind of like spiritual psychosis, right? It's like these little rabbit holes that I know you've fallen into, I've fallen into. I don't know anyone that does this work, especially anyone that does this work professionally, who hasn't fallen into a rabbit hole from time to time. But the thing is that it feels like we had a lot more time to kind of flounder around. There's something about like it's a soul retrieval. Instead of a psychosis, it's a soul-cosis. There is a soul-cosis happening. And it's because these newer waves of like awakened people, and specifically they feel like they are between 15 and 25. I don't know why, but that's the demographic they're giving me. It's 15 to 25, it feels like. And they are expanding so much faster than they can learn, than their point of experience. But we had time to flounder around. When I first had my big awakening, it was when Capricorn and Cancer were in the nodes, which conveniently are also my nodes. I have a Capricorn North node and a Cancer South node. Now we're moving into Taurus and Scorpio. And so it seems as though they don't have the same amount of time to kind of flop around like we did. It's like they don't have the time to fall into a bunch of psychoses. Like they don't have the time to sit here and like learn piece by piece by piece all of like the wisdom and the knowledge and like everything that like we had to learn kind of like the hard way, the long way, the really confusing, take a detour, then take another detour, go up half a block, take one more detour. Like it feels like they don't have time for that. I'm not really sure why. Perhaps thinking of like that demographic, they're probably Pluto in, I don't know, probably like Sagittarius or maybe even Capricorn. I'm Pluto in Scorpio. And so my generation is kind of like the generation of destruction, right? Like Scorpio kind of tears everything down so that way it can be built back up better. And so maybe that's part of the energy is like they're kind of on the construction crew. We've been on the destruction crew and like this new wave, like this new generation that's coming forward. They're coming online a lot faster. They're expanding a lot faster, but they don't have kind of the time that we had to like roll around with like our eyes closed in the dark trying to figure it out because they have to start like building. It feels like very shortly after they come online, they start building. And so it's kind of like they need more direction, right? They need to kind of be able to see the signposts that we have laid out already as we kind of forage through the wilderness for so long. Does that make sense? So that way they can actually go in and do the retrieval and not so much of the psychosis thing. It's they're gonna have an easier time, but part of the way that they have an easier time is via the way that we as readers are, again, directing the flow of energy into the most constructive or beneficial place. And we do that, again, by not just observing the energy, but pulling, okay, this little bird right above me, but also pulling out like the wisdom and the direction in the energy that we're reading. Now, the Eight of Fire and the Hangman come up next. So one, when I saw the 8, I immediately thought of Scorpio. And so, okay, organize my thoughts. And so I'm looking at this 8 of Fire, and part of it is the actual message coming forward, like they're coming, like the new collective, like the youngest collective, the next wave of the Ascension kids, they are coming forward. And they're coming forward in these new nodes, the Scorpio and the Taurus nodes. And up until this point, they have been stuck in this hangman energy between comfort and transformation. It's kind of like we had to work through the backlog of our energy as readers. The collectives that we are a part of and the collectives that we read for had to clear out the backlog of all of this energy too, in order to make room for this new collective of like the next ascension wave. So they've been kind of hanging out like Malcolm in the middle between transformation and comfort. And there's this message that's coming through as they are coming, and they're coming very shortly. When I pulled this hangman, it felt like these retrograde energies. And so there seems to be something as when the retrograde goes direct, which I think is like February 3rd. I think it's like February 3rd to April 29th. Again, they're waves. When these retrogrades go direct, like the first wave of the newly awakened are coming in. And again, they're not floundering around kind of like we were. It's like we are kind of like street smarts, but they're more interested in like book smarts. but we got pages and pages of experience here, which is also kind of why we are being asked to organize it. It's like this 10 of air. It's like when the influx of all of these messages come in, we could just pluck them in like one at a time and observe it and read it, but we could also gather them together and make them in the shape of an arrow. Like that way, trust me, you want to go that way. I took that detour 8 blocks back and it set me back 6 months. Go that way. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. It's kind of like a funny reading to read for me. It's just interesting. But when these retrogrades go direct, they're almost going to shift out of that kind of comfort or that tied up energy, that being stuck in the middle, and they're going to move directly into transformation, which basically just means movement. Like the process has begun for them and the process now begins for us in a new way. It kind of reminds me of when I was a bartender for 10 years and we'd have like a bar crawl or like a bike crawl come through, and we'd just be going through the same routine every single day. It's 2:00, so-and-so is here for their Miller Lite, right? It's like clockwork. And then all of a sudden it's like the wind would shift. Like you'd feel disturbance in the atmosphere and someone would go, there's a bike crawl coming. I just saw them at like the bar 2 blocks away. And like, so it's like you knew that they were coming. So it's like you had like that 2 block window in order to like mentally prepare yourself and get like the tools that you needed in order to be able to keep up with like the wave. And again, it's like it'd be 50 people in the bar, they'd be there for a little while and then they'd leave, and then like the next wave would come. And so in a funny way, that kind of seems to be like what is happening. Now, when they come in, they're coming in as the 2 of water. So again, it feels like we learn through street smarts. We learn through like direct experience and struggle, but they feel more like book smart. Like they want direction, like they want like solid guidance. They want a little bit more of a blueprint. But because of this 2 of water, they also feel much more like egalitarian than us. It's like, I know that we use the word spiritual community all the time, but sometimes I wonder why we use that term. Because we are in spiritual communities, but especially like when it comes to readers and amongst readers, honestly, like we're really kind of on our own. And there's like a variety of reasons for that, but it's like a reader and their collective or their community, but there isn't a lot of community amongst the readers themselves. There is some, but overall, it's really kind of like a solo thing. It just seems to be what's happening, but it's not the same for them. They're much more egalitarian. They're much more communal, which is kind of going back to this 7 of air. Like they come in a group. It's again, they want the book smarts, like they want the information. They don't have time to dick around or flounder around like we did. And then they also cross-reference with each other. They are going to build with each other much more successfully than I think we have. And so there's this interesting dynamic about kind of like this generation of readers that are coming forward as well, and kind of how they're shifting. It sort of gives me the feeling that like a lot of the readers that like I came up watching, they were originally very much in their mother energy, right? Like they were kind of doing this, but now it kind of feels like they're moving more into like a crone or like a sage stage. Regardless of age, it doesn't matter, but it's just because it's like, I feel like the readers that I came up with are now kind of like the elders. Whereas the readers that I started out with, or those of you that have been like doing this, we're kind of moving from a maiden stage, from our maiden voyage, into now of this mother energy, right? It's like phases, the phases of the moon. And then this new collective that is very quickly moving into their maiden stage, like their maiden journey. Does that make sense? So there's this interesting kind of shifting that's happening about us getting more of the resources that we need to kind of sustain ourselves in our lives so we can come forward and keep doing this work. It's like this refreshment, right? So we can keep coming forward to do this work, but more intentionally direct where the energy is best suited to go, as opposed to just observing it. Because the people that we came up with are now moving into the elders, so it's like we kind of have to move forward and like kind of fill that spot. And then sort of where we were, this next generation is coming forward. But again, they don't have 3 years to flounder around and figure it out by like cause and effect. It's like they need the information. It's like they need the golden nuggets. It's like they need the pearls more than the oysters. But they work together with each other much more effectively than, let's say, even we do. They cross-reference with each other. It's part of a successful construction process. It's like the plumber has to know what the electrician is doing, who needs to know what the concrete guy is doing, and the guy that's doing it, right? It's like, whereas like we're kind of building like our own structures, they are building more communal structures. And that's likely because part of this construction process that they're doing from a spiritual position also has a lot more worldly impact. So part of what they're constructing and building is also new systems, new institutions. It's the stuff that society also needs, and it's coming from this deeply enriched spiritual place, from this place of higher consciousness and perspective. Again, it's more egalitarian, it's more equal, it's more fair. It's like the real justice system, right? But they're coming through it through the lens of spirituality first, before they take it in the world and actually start physically building these new structures that all of our society needs. And we seem to be saving them a lot of time by sharing with them kind of our trials and our many errors, ways in which we had done things differently, common pitfalls to avoid. But because of the wisdom and the experience that we have now, we have the ability to direct them in a way that expedites their process, in, again, more of a beneficial way. Now, the curse and the owl come up next. I don't like the curse card. I do, but I always usually call it the secret as opposed to the curse. But the way it's coming forward today, it's coming through as the resistance. And it's interesting to me that there's this shadow over the mouth. And I think that I've been noticing a trend, and maybe a lot of you guys have as well, about the throat chakra. There's been a lot of difficulty with people's throat chakras being able to express themselves. There's this resistance here. This feels like us. It's like this chokehold that is maybe even making it more difficult for us to speak up or speak out, share our stories, be a little bit more vulnerable, share some of our experiences. There might even be some difficulty or resistance in kind of shifting the way that we read. It's like, even for me, doing this reading right now feels a little bit like pulling teeth. And it's only because like it's kind of unusual for me to do a reading for readers, of which I am also a part of, and I don't know how it's going to be taken. Some of you guys might hate this fucking reading, and that's cool. That's your business, right? But it's like that. I felt a lot of resistance, like a lot of this chokehold energy just coming in, trying to do this read. And so whether it's the things that you want to talk about, the kind of spiritual food that you're dishing out, part of your story, sharing your experience, your trial and errors, more about yourself, vulnerability, whatever it is, there seems to be this resistance to speak. But this owl is coming forward. It's almost like this stare off. It's kind of like we're staring at spirit. Like spirit, it's like this owl, this higher perspective is kind of looking at us like, go forward, like go put the messages out, go direct the energy, create the wave. Don't just ride it, like create the wave, channel the energy in a different way. And us kind of going, we're trying, but like it's difficult. Like we're trying, but like it's really hard to get out. Like it's trying, but like I don't feel super comfortable sharing that story or speaking on that thing. But it's like this owl just keeps staring at us. It's kind of like this, almost like this nagging energy. It's like, just do it. Just do it. It's like this reading. I was like, I don't know. They're like, just do it. That's kind of how it feels. So it's like a little bit of this stare off that is going on right now. But I think that also might be part of the difficulty, part of the resistance that we're speaking. Because again, it almost feels like the energy for us isn't organically going in that direction. We could very easily stay where we are and keep doing what we're doing. But it is an intentional shift that we are being asked to make. So that way we are kind of like in the right place with the right message at the right time when these retrogrades go direct and this first wave of like the new kids on the block kind of show up. It's almost like needing to get like the practice hours in. You need to get comfortable with it. Again, you have a 2 block window. Speak up, wet your whistle, get comfortable with it, because this new wave will be here soon. And you want to feel good and confident about what you're delivering to them. Does that make sense? Because the 2 of Earth comes up next. And so it's kind of like this owl saying, you kind of got to make a decision. It's like kind of shit or get off the pot. It's like you can stay doing what you're doing and it's fine, right? But like there is this opportunity for you to choose like a higher or like a different option right now, to speak on something that is different, to read on a different story. It's that kind of thing. And it kind of makes me wonder what this resistance is. And it kind of brings up this idea of teacher, student, leader, follower. Like it's that kind of thing. Like I don't like the word like teacher and leader, not necessarily because it brings up the idea of less than and more than, but it's this idea of like responsibility. Like when I think of like a leader, I don't think of someone that's like better or worse than me. I think of it as like a leader is someone who has a lot of responsibility. And so there might be part of the resistance, and again, I'm just musing here, but maybe part of the resistance to speaking up about different things, sharing guidance in a different way, giving like actual guidance as opposed to just observing the energy. It's a resistance to taking on like more responsibility, which is kind of a funny energy because when you think about it, we already do take on a level of responsibility when we come forward and we give messages, right? And so it's like, I look at my channel, like I don't have a particularly like large channel in comparison to others, but conversation breeds consciousness and expansion. So even with my channel being a bit smaller, every time I come on and I do a message, I do a reading, I give a motivational speech, regardless of what I'm talking about, that conversation breeds consciousness and expansion in others. And I am responsible for that. I could choose a myriad of things to talk about on a day-to-day basis on this channel. But depending on what I choose, that conversation is going to expand you in a different way. I might bring forth something that you never thought about before, expansion. I might bring forth something that turns out you don't actually really agree with. Okay, well, that's still expansion because you have a greater idea now of what you do and do not resonate with, right? I could bring forth something that you were already thinking about, and that breeds your expansion because now you have confirmation for the direction your thoughts were already going, right? And so there is this idea that like we have resistance to stepping forward a little bit more, to more actively kind of direct the energy or give specific guidance, share our stories, be vulnerable because of the responsibility that might be involved in that. But the kicker is that we're already responsible for the messages that we give, all of it. Does that make sense? And so it's kind of like, it's not really that big of a choice. It's almost more intentionally acknowledging what it is that you're already doing and refining the process in which you do it. Again, looking like a little bit ahead of the energy. And maybe some of that has to do with like worthiness or like self-esteem. Like sometimes it could be difficult for us to call ourselves like a teacher or like a leader or just any of those terms. I don't like labels to begin with, but sometimes it's just feeling like we don't fit those shoes, right? It's like teacher, like I would never consider myself to be a teacher, but I literally have 30 students. In the worker bee, it's like a mystery school that I run on Patreon. I'm like, I'm not a teacher. Well, then how do I have 30 students if I'm not a teacher, right? Like, does that make sense? And so it's kind of this funny thing of not fully recognizing like who you are and like kind of the magnitude of like what it is you actually do. So by feeling sort of restrained or pulling away from the idea of responsibility, it's kind of laughable because you are already sitting in kind of a position of authority and responsibility anyway. So it's like you may as well just like choose it intentionally because it's kind of what you're already doing. And once you kind of acknowledge it, you're able to do it in like a more refined way. This 8 of Earth comes up next. Speaking of refinement and repetition, it's sort of the idea that it's like you have a lot of experience under your belt now. It's like you've done a lot of readings, like you've worked with a lot of people. It's like there are these fruits coming off of here, and it's kind of like they're ready to be plucked and like given out to others. But there's also this message of like, when you choose this option, that there is like a reverberation that comes off of this 8 of Earth. It's almost like as soon as you agree to it, like you just kind of acknowledge like, yes, there perhaps is like a new wave of people coming in that need a lot more guidance, or they want specific details. Like again, it's a different process than what we went through. Okay, I'll do it. Like I will go forward. I will open my mouth. I will speak about these topics. I'm willing to be not just a vessel for messages, but a vessel for guidance. I will direct the flow of the energy. Like I will show where the signposts are, as opposed to just observing them alongside the people that I'm reading for. And it feels like once you kind of pluck that string, it kind of lights up this little lantern. It's like you respond to the call of action, and then this new wave, their lanterns sort of light up. It's like they pick up the signal, because then the 2 of Fire comes up, and then they start transitioning, right? Then they start kind of making their way towards. This is like when you can see the bar crawl coming from like a block away, and here they have the lantern in their midst. And I just feel like they're coming over like a dry climate, which is kind of interesting. It feels like it's dry for me means intellectual. It feels like part of this new wave, they are spiritually curious. Like they come from like a much more like analytical or like a much more mental kind of way that they observe these energies, right? Like there's something kind of academic about the way they feel. Whereas we traveled more, like my generation of readers, like we traveled more through like a wet climate. It was very emotional, like it was a little muddy, like it's different. Theirs is kind of dry and airy, and ours was sort of wet and earthy. But when they make their way to us, we then become these rainmakers, because there is an element of the earth, there is an element of water, and it feels like this journey makes them a little bit thirsty. Again, there is a need for spiritual nourishment. They are thirsty for spiritual nourishment, and we are coming in to give them rain. And I think that it's kind of beautiful that when we started the reading, the readers were coming forward as this wounded warrior, very kind of contracted within oneself, kind of conserving one's energy, one's resources. But by the end, we are expanded, just like this energy up here, who released to us some necessary resources that we needed. And I like that she's dancing, because it gives them this idea of flow and rhythm and melody, which also kind of is coming in right now as like, we practice what we preach, we practice what we teach, that we dance by the melody of the guidance that we give as well. And so that makes us kind of like a good example of not only how these energies, what these energies are, but also how they have the ability to play out in someone's life. But they are thirsty for spiritual knowledge, and we are going to give them rain. And the last card in this reading is the upper world. And so it feels like another deposit. It feels like another deposit comes forward, and you see how it's dropping like this little blue circle, and then it lands right on us. We receive it. And so there's like multiple receptions happening. There is the release of the resources or the necessities that you need. There's also a revelation of kind of what's been going on in like the collective child, and why the messages have been so repetitive for so long, or why there's been this creative energy that's been really difficult to kind of permeate the collective spirit. There's also kind of about to be the release of like the newest collective that seems to be coming through, and how they in very many ways are different than you or me and how we learned, but they are coming forward for their maiden journey. And the resistance that we feel to speaking our truth, sharing our knowledge, our trials, our errors, being vulnerable, feeling as though we kind of have the ability to guide and direct the energy just as much as we have the ability to just observe it and read it for what it is allowing us to kind of fully embody like who we are and what we do best. But in that, it also sets off a signal to the others that it's like, you know what they say? It's like when the student is ready, the teacher appears. In very many ways, it kind of feels like when the teacher is ready, the students appear. And they come forward, thirsty for this knowledge, and we water them. And so the divine then releases us more water, which is more consciousness, it's more downloads, it's the change in the energy, right? It is the spiritual food, it is the mana in which to give them. And again, part of it is because they don't have as much time to street smart it as we did, because they need to start building, and they need to start building relatively soon. And so they're kind of moving through this wave of initiation. It's a new wave of initiates coming forward. So this is what I have. This is a very difficult reading to get through. I hope that I post it. I might not. I might post it though. We'll see. But I am going to go do an extended reading because I feel like I want to do that. So if you're interested in seeing kind of how else this wants to play out, the link to the extended reading will be the top one in the description box. I love you very much. I appreciate you being here and spending this time with me. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope that it made sense to you. I really hope that it made sense to you. But I love you so much. I appreciate you being here. And if you need me, you know where to find me. I'll catch you next time.